Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining. My name is Peter Bach, and I'm a research scientist at ERWAG in Switzerland. And I'll be talking to you a bit about urban green spaces and blue spaces and the topic of livability. Nature itself has been recognized as quite important in urban planning, especially since the early 1900s with the Garden City movement. But if there's one thing that the pandemic in the recent 2 years has reminded us of, it's of the value that nature can provide to our sanities. Just looking at some mobility reports during lockdowns, we see that visitations to parks have increased substantially during this period. And this is not just the case in Australia, but we're seeing many papers emerge around the world who have conducted this kind of analysis, not only during lockdowns, but also after lockdowns were lifted. So there's a growing recognition of nature in cities. And when we think about planning or designing nature in cities, we think often of the topic of blue-green systems or nature-based solutions. However you want to call them, they're known by many other names, including water-sensitive urban design, low-impact development, ABC waters, you name it. And these are a variety of systems and practices that combine your water, your vegetation, and other elements for multiple benefits. Most notably, we characterize them as strategically planned networks of interconnected natural and semi-natural areas that provide a whole range of ecosystem services, often designed from a multifunctional perspective. So you may get a system for stormwater management that also mitigates urban heat. They are implemented through spatial planning measures or engineered as nature-based technologies, so thinking bioretention systems or constructed wetlands. And their composition is often of either and or green and water features. The blue itself in the name also implies a central role for urban water management. If you think a tree and vegetation generally for urban heat mitigation, often they do require a certain moisture level so that they can drive evapotranspiration as well. So water is quite central in maintaining and enhancing these systems. I want to focus on the strategically planned networks element, because when we think of these interconnected networks, a lot of different essential aspects come to mind. For one, these kinds of networks can help safeguard human health and enhance well-being, either through providing safety, mental physical health, opportunities, and even sustainable transport options through bicycle paths. They have been shown to help mitigate urban heat through ventilation corridors. The city of Zurich, for example, recently published a heat mitigation plan which strives to modify the urban form to allow air from the surrounding rural regions to flow into the city at night, especially. But also biodiversity protection and enhancement. Urbanization tends to fragment the landscape and impede movement of species through the landscape. This leads to a decrease in genetic diversity and habitat loss, and can then harm biodiversity worldwide. So protecting these and enhancing these has become quite essential, especially in the recent years with a lot of the calls for biodiversity protection. The networks connect people through the city, and they connect different administrative areas, allowing for opportunities for better governance and better social network formation. And of course, I can't forget urban drainage. These natural areas can help attenuate flows and provide some flood protection as well. So we've looked at these kinds of elements and are looking at some of these elements through the modeling that we've been doing, in particular a model that I've built called the UrbanBEATS Planning Support System. It was initially designed to help plan out different blue-green infrastructure technologies like bioretention systems, wetlands, ponds and basins in an urban landscape. But we've since developed it to support a much broader set of blue-green infrastructure options. And we're trying to look at a much broader scale. It's a spatial temporal model. It's multi-scalar, but it uses a conceptual representation, either cell-based or patch-based, and can be used to explore different scenarios, whether it's future scenarios or different alternative planning scenarios. The focus here is on the spatial mapping module, where we're looking at moving beyond individual technologies to a more broader spatial level, understanding different kinds of networks, different kinds of neighborhood relationships. Here's just an example of some of the maps that the model produces, like drainage flow paths, green space networks, access to green space, and functional connectivity, which is a biodiversity concept that looks at species movement. And so we've employed different types of techniques like spatial stats, analyses, Euclidean distances for simplicity, and are moving towards more graph theoretical approaches and circuit theory, which is a biodiversity-based or ecological approach in the ecological theory to assessing species movement. I'd like to illustrate some of the work we've done in this model in a comparison of Zurich and Melbourne. So we got data sets from both cities and we modeled the representation of these areas. Roughly the same area that encompasses the central business district with roughly the same population, but significantly different urban densities. Zurich is much more dense and has some agricultural fields and forested areas apart from the urban regions, whereas Melbourne is a lot more sprawled and green spaces tend to be a lot more scattered and placed along the waterways. Here, for example, you can see some outputs from the module that we're working on, which shows the distance from residential areas to the nearest green space. We tend to talk about walkability to the nearest green areas, and often 400 meters is sort of the indicator number or the rule of thumb that we use. And you can see, just comparing these two areas, how they are very remarkable differences in green space arrangements, but also potential livability aspects. And so the question is, how can we enhance this through better spatial planning? In terms of Zurich, we may want to consider increasing the quality of the green spaces, as their access is quite good. In most of the cases less than 400 meters, so easily walkable. Whereas in Melbourne, we may think about increasing the different types of green spaces and the number of green spaces. We do notice that, looking at the Melbourne case, that a lot of the green spaces are also along waterways, and so this can be a very strategic aspect to look at, so that we can protect our urban aquatic environments. When we then move on and look at other aspects that UrbanBEATS can focus on as well, we can see how different green spaces relate to drainage flow paths. Maybe some of these spaces can act as buffers for flood retention, runoff reduction, and also protecting stream ecology. We can see also administrative areas differ between the two cities, and this brings into question really how we could relate these green spaces to the governance of them, and how they may be shared between different council or jurisdictional boundaries. So these are a number of different aspects that the module is really looking into, and adding to that the biodiversity as well. And we're taking this work further and diving much deeper into this multifunctional aspect. So we've done some very simple Euclidean distances, but we're moving towards more detailed network analysis, trying to represent the urban form as a much more detailed detailed cluster of patches of different land uses, because this will enable us to do methods like least cost paths to start optimizing where green spaces could be placed in future, and also look at how we can construct the social networks and later on the socio-ecological networks. I sort of want to finish off and showing some of the work that is now emerging in the biodiversity space, where we are analyzing corridors of species movement throughout an urban landscape. And here are just some examples. If you're interested, you can read a bit more about it at the UrbanBEATS website. But to sort of wrap up, there are really three key takeaways that we've come to recognize through this work. And that is that urban green and blue spaces are really the lungs of a city and can provide a range of different benefits for humans and for animals. And we need to plan these more strategically. Blue-green systems lend themselves quite nicely to addressing these kinds of aspects, and we must encompass both the technological and the spatial connectivity aspects of these systems. So maybe we can complement green spaces with the more engineered solutions like bioretentions or streetscape swales and streetscape greenery. But multifunctional aspects are still essential. If we want to build a business case for these systems, we need to be able to provide livability enhancements while safeguarding natural capital. So on that note, I will end here. It's been a brief overview, but I hope it's given you a bit of an insight into where the research that I'm involved in is sort of moving towards. And if you'd like to know more, you can catch me at any of the websites or my YouTube channel. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to subscribe and like this video and press the notification bell if you want to know a bit more, and so you'll be notified of new videos coming out. And if you're watching this at the conference, then I look forward to taking your questions and engaging in some insightful discussions. So thanks to my colleagues who have been part of this journey as well. And thank you very much for your attention.